This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. Today is my privilege to have as a guest on the Wet Lunch in the High Seas podcast my good friend Rylan Hamilton. Ryland began his career as a U.S. Navy engineering and surface warfare officer before earning his MBA at Harvard Business School and transitioning into robotics. As an early leader at Amazon Robotics, he helped scale the global deployment of industrial automation across Amazon's fulfillment network. He later co-founded Six River Systems, a pioneering warehouse robotics company that introduced one of the first collaborative autonomous mobile robots for logistics, which was ultimately acquired by Shopify. Today, Ryland is a co-founder and CEO of Blue Water Autonomy, a Boston-based company designing and building autonomous ships for the U.S. Navy and commercial customers. And I'd just like to add that Ryland and I both have a deep interest in ships in the sea, and we've had two separate careers that have involved this, and it's wonderful to see both of these paths converging today. Rylan, thank you so much for appearing today.
Steve, thanks for having me.
To start off, tell me about your childhood and education. You have grown up with a deep love of ships in the sea, and as well as engineering and mathematics and entrepreneurship. Can you talk about who were your major influences? I do know your late father was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and a submarine officer. You've also long admired Theodore Roosevelt and how he greatly expanded the U.S. Navy during his presidency.
Well, there's a lot in that question. I appreciate the introduction. I've always had a passion for the sea, but it wasn't obvious when I was growing up. I was a city boy growing up in Boston. My father passed away when I was younger, but as you mentioned, he went to the Naval Academy. He served on nuclear submarines in the 60s. And then a grandfather who served in the Pacific. But I don't think it was until my mother sent me away to summer camps in Maine and where I started to sail that I really found a passion for the water. And then I later evolved from sailing on lakes in Maine to sailing in Buzzards Bay, which is just off Cape Cod. And I just found that I was just, in my happy place when I was out on the water.
And talk about what inspired you to become an entrepreneur. This is something that you were interested in college. What was sort of in the background there?
Steve, I think we had similar paths to kind of right out of college where we didn't know what we wanted to do. I took sort of what I thought was the sort of more obvious kind of career path coming out of college and tried sort of professional service jobs, whether it's like investment banking or consulting, and didn't really find a passion. I'm not really well suited to be behind a computer from 9 to 5 in an office every day. And so I wanted to find something more exciting and more inspiring. And similar to you, when I was in college, 9/11 happened. And I really kind of, reset everything I thought about what I wanted to do in my life. And I kind of went back to some of my roots and said, maybe there's something more interesting to do than kind of, taking these more traditional jobs, and decided to explore kind of paths in military service, specifically the Navy, since I really just enjoyed being on the water so much.
So you graduated from college in 2002. You were a year behind me, and this was in this new post 9/11 landscape, and you ultimately enlisted in the U.S. Navy and went to OCS. What were some lessons that you learned during your time as an officer during this transformative time? I mean, you were young and the world had changed since the big terrorist attack in New York. What did you notice about U.S. naval strategy and operations in this new landscape? And what are some good stories you have from your time as an officer?
So I learned a lot when I was in the Navy. I learned about leadership. I learned about being on a team that was very mission oriented. I learned about operating under pressure, and it really kind of formed sort of me as a young adult and really set me up for sort of the rest of my career. But, my first kind of real experience on a ship was out in the Persian Gulf. And so I actually remember the first day that I flew out to go meet my ship. I flew in through Bahrain. I spent a couple of days there. And then the day that I was flying out to meet my ship and I was in a helicopter, I actually landed on sort of what you call a marine sort of aircraft carrier, an LHA. And at the time, Iran was test firing some missiles and the whole ship went into general quarters. And I was dressed kind of like I am today, with in civilian clothes. And so this is my first time on a real Navy ship out to sea. And I just started like running up and down like the stairs, not knowing even where to go, because this was just a temporary ship till I found my full ship. And someone grabbed me and said, "You don't look like you know what you're doing." I'm like, "That's right." They pulled me into a room, said, "Just stand here." And so I stood there, and a couple hours later, we got out of general quarters. Everything was fine, but everyone was worried about like chemical attacks, like who knew what was happening. And so this was like my first experience into the fleet, and it was an eye-opening experience. I learned a lot, but I was kind of like thrown into the fire. And so I eventually made it to my ship that day, and here we were operating in the Persian Gulf. It was February of 2003, just before we invaded Iraq, and there was Operation Iraqi Freedom. We're unloading Marines on into Kuwait. And, they just threw me, a junior ensign, onto the bridge, and I was learning how to be a junior officer deck and a conning officer. And it was an amazing experience. I was drinking from the fire hose and learning a lot. But boy, did I made some great friends, and I still keep in touch with them today. And that was like the start of like my 4-year kind of naval service.
Uh-huh. Well, I get the sense that you loved, as much of a trial by fire as that was, there was an adrenaline rush, because on one hand, you're learning on the fly, but there's also, as you know, when you're at sea, there's not much room for messing up.
There's no room for error. And I think when you go through something like officer candidate school, it's all about attention to detail and getting the little things right. And when you're go through something officer candidate school, you're like, well, why does this matter? Why do I have to iron my, undershirts into 4x4-inch squares? Like, does that really matter? And if you can't follow the instructions about how to iron your undershirts, well, then how can you expect it to take control of a naval warship as like a junior officer or an officer of the deck? And so all of that training really kind of set me up for my sort of first experience in the fleet. But it's great. And I think, similar to being an entrepreneur and being into startups, it's kind of similar, where sometimes you just get thrown into the fire and you got to figure out how to operate. And there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of ambiguity, but you've got to rally the team and figure out like what's actually important, and then align everyone along those objectives. And so, that experience was super helpful for everything I did, after the Navy.
I mean, in my own career researching ship design, it's a similar thing in that the smallest error in a ship design can cause a major catastrophe. We can rattle off a number of civilian and naval catastrophes where one small error in navigation or ship design can doom the whole vessel. So I think that applies in both operations and design.
Yeah. I think there's this connection between being like naval architects and then architects. And like when you design a ship, it's a combination of like art and science, how you kind of put stuff together. But I think one thing we've learned in naval architecture is actually how to make these ships like super survivable. And if there are a lot of mistakes that we've made that have actually cost a lot of lives, not because the ships were hit by, missiles or aircraft or anything, just because they didn't survive out at sea. And so, yeah, it's been, as I've kind of transitioned from kind of where my career went after the Navy, which is like warehouse automation and robotics, into sort of like designing and building ships. I've definitely learned a lot about like the history of ships, and we can talk more about that on the podcast.
Did you ever regret that you didn't go to study to be a naval architect, or not?
I don't know. Actually, I guess when I was growing up, I thought I wanted to be an architect. I didn't realize this whole field of being a naval architect. But I don't know, maybe looking back, it would have been a really interesting kind of career path. Actually, when I joined the Navy, I actually thought maybe I'd want to stay in the Navy for an entire career. And I got close, but I loved actually being on ships and just, being out to sea, and whether it's doing a refueling at sea or landing aircraft or doing some type of other mission. But when I finished my kind of initial 4-year tour in the Navy, and then my next job would have been sort of what the Navy calls this like shore duty, I said that would actually be pretty boring, like just sitting behind a desk or something like that. But like if you told me I could spend 20 years in the Navy just driving ships around, like I would have actually been enticed to stay in the Navy, because like that's just like, it's an amazing job. There's a lot of stress, but it's just something that's very fulfilling.
I also just get the sense that people I know who've been at sea, there is kind of like, whether you're sailing or whether you're operating a vessel, there is kind of a flow state. You're focused. There's no room for distractions. And I think that's something that's kind of lacking today. So much, typical career paths. But you return to Harvard to receive your MBA and then turn your entrepreneurial energy to robotics. Can you talk about the transition from being a naval officer to business school and how that sharpened your focus on what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to like when I graduated from college, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. But again, I knew I didn't want to do sort of a traditional job behind a desk. So I had a couple short stints at 2 companies before I got into robotics. One was a startup where it was the first full-time hire. And that was the first kind of summer after I graduated from business school. Super exciting, but I realized like how hard startups are. And then the second was a company called Vistaprint, just outside of Boston, which was actually one of the leaders in actually developing a really profitable online business before sort of e-commerce was kind of like a big thing. And I learned a lot from those experiences. But when I saw a company just outside of Boston called Kiva Systems, and they had these cool orange mobile robots moving shelving around, helping automate e-commerce warehouses, I was hooked. It was just kind of like walking onto a ship. I was like, this is cool. There's hardware, there's software, there's a large system. You've got to make this thing work and hum. But when you do make it work and hum, it's just really inspiring. And so I quickly kind of found my passion into that space, but it wasn't something that was obvious when I kind of got out of business school.
So it's an interesting combination of both numbers and business, but also producing something tactile, which is a wonderful feeling. And you can see it work and you're responsible for it working. And I think that's unusual because so many people go into the business world, they go into these they go into law, they go into these very relatively abstract numbers-based things. But here you see the product at work.
Yeah, I think once you produce something that's tactile as part of a business, it's really hard to go any other business where you don't produce something. Because when you have something that's tactile and you're really inspired about, you want to talk to your friends about it, you want to talk to your family about it, you think about it all the time, and it's very fungible. And it's really hard to go into another business where it's like a service business or something like that. It's just not as like, you don't wake up in the morning and be like, as inspired.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes dealing with things you create is easier than dealing with people. So there's less drama. Well, maybe that's debatable, but anyway. Tell me about the formation of Six River Systems, which you have built up and eventually sold to Shopify. Tell me about this company and how the team you assembled and the products you made.
Yeah. So similar to my 4 formative years in the Navy, I had 4 very formative years at this company called Kiva Systems that got bought by Amazon, became Amazon Robotics. And in a very good way, it was a wild ride where we went from a couple thousand robots in the field when I started to like over 10,000 robots in the field when I left. And it was kind of this hockey slope growth that we went through. And I learned a lot. And I learned about what it means to be like what Amazon called like an Amazon athlete, just able to do a lot of different things, move fast, make decisions, and kind of rally teams behind you. And I actually had an opportunity to go move to Seattle. So I was working just outside of Boston. The company eventually became Amazon Robotics just outside of Boston. And I kind of hit a ceiling, at that company. And my boss at the time, who was the president and chief operating officer, Amy Villeneuve, gave me an opportunity. She said, look, if you want to continue your career, you should probably move to Seattle where there's a lot of different opportunities and you can continue to challenge yourself. And I was definitely tempted, but I, was born and raised in Boston. And so I eventually left for another startup, but just those 4 years were just amazing. I met a lot of really interesting people. And so when I was exploring what's next, just outside of Boston, I actually was looking to join a company. I didn't think, I'd been at a startup just after business school. It's really hard. You've got to get the team together. You got to get the capital. You got to make sure you pick the right idea. It takes years to even know if you're onto something. But when I started exploring other robotics companies in the Boston area, what I saw is the technology that Amazon Robotics was built off at the time, which is basically mobile robots following stickers on the ground using very cost-effective sensors, had evolved to where you can now make mobile robots using kind of like best-in-class sensors, which didn't cost as much anymore, some of the same sensors that you put on autonomous vehicles. And now you could really rethink how you could design an automation system. So instead of designing an automation system for a greenfield where you went in and you had an open concrete floor and then you installed the system on top of it, you could actually design mobile robots that actually could be integrated into existing warehouses. So you could leverage all the existing infrastructure like shelving and IT and Wi-Fi and other elements, and then basically automate a warehouse in weeks and not months. And so I ended up convincing a couple other people that I'd worked with before to kind of go start this company called Six River Systems just outside of Boston.
I mean, I've been out of Boston for quite a while, but one of the things that I find fascinating when you go to Cambridgeport near MIT is just when we were in college, there was not a whole lot going on around there. But now there's this whole tech infrastructure that's just blown up around Boston. Could you speak to how sort of the entrepreneurial landscape and the tech landscape in Boston has evolved and what made you decide is that part of the reason why you wanted to stay? Was there such a ecosystem of technology and venture capital there?
There is. So there's capital in Boston, there's venture capital firms, and then also you have access to venture capital firms on the West Coast. And then there's just amazing talent in Boston. And when I talk about talent, I talk about people who can do the hardware and the software take something from, a kitchen table and just an idea to something that can be scaled to hundreds, if not thousands of warehouses or to millions of customer homes. And so there's kind of this history of companies like iRobot, Amazon Robotics, Deck, others that just basically have talent that have done that. And I've been able to leverage that. And so like over time, since I've been in Boston for such, a while, I have a really strong network of really impressive people. And those are the people that allow you to kind of form these companies. And in addition to like the talent that comes from those companies, you have all these great colleges and universities around the Boston area, like MIT, Harvard, Northeastern, Boston University, Tufts, WPI. I mean, the list kind of goes on. And so not only do you have people who've kind of been there and done that before, you have this pipeline of these, brilliant kind of students just graduating, looking for something like really cool to do. And so that this whole ecosystem is really powerful. There are other kind of areas like San Francisco has a really strong tech scene. I think what I've seen in San Francisco and other areas like that is like people get drawn to either, oh, I'm going to go work for Google or I'm going to go work for Uber. And those companies pay a lot. And so they end up sometimes like just drawing some of the talent away to these big companies. Or there end up being these trends like AI or something like that, or SaaS, which are also really impressive companies and kind of categories to be in. But those categories also end up kind of sucking up a lot of the talent. And so like the robotics companies, have to compete against these like high flying kind of like software only companies, where in the Boston area, it's more of a portfolio of different types of companies where I'm not always trying to compete with like Google or Uber for talent.
It's more of a niche thing. It's something that you're looking for I guess you can say, more unusual graduates of these schools who are looking for something cool versus I want to just join the name brand. I want to try.
It goes back to like
something different.
There's certain people that are just wired where they want to make this tangible product that's out there. And what I found is some of the best engineers really like working at an early stage company because they get to build. And so if you think about your day, like 90% of your day is just on building, and you're not like dealing with like the bureaucracy of these bigger companies and these massive roadmaps and trying to get buy-in and these matrix organization. It's just like, come in and let's go build something. And, we're not going to get it right the first time, but we keep iterating and working on it over time. And that's what a lot of like, some of the best engineers want to do. And so that's the attraction to coming kind of to an earlier stage company.
I mean, that reminds me of another assistant secretary of the Navy, another Roosevelt, FDR, who during the heady days of the early New Deal, and he gathered together all these brain trust people and all these people from the universities and the White House. When people asked, well, what's your roadmap? And he said, well, things are kind of crazy right now. Try it and let's see what happens. Now tell me more about Blue Water Autonomy. And autonomous ships are a huge leap forward from robots in warehouses. There are no typhoons or rogue waves or enemy fire in an Amazon warehouse. Can you talk about the design criteria for your company's ships for the U.S. Navy and for commercial clients? I mean, we've reached this sort of inflection point of robotics, and now you have the coming of AI. And I think that one business historian I spoke to, John Steele Gordon, said that we are kind of like the biggest change in cultural history since the inventing in Western Europe of the printing press. Can you talk more about the design criteria and also who is doing your design work, getting back to naval architecture?
So we are designing and building autonomous ships for the Navy and then eventually for commercial customers too. When we think about our design criteria, we're designing them for the open ocean. So these are ships that need to be able to operate across, for example, the Pacific. So they need to be able to operate for thousands of nautical miles for months at a time without people on board. And so, Steve, I know you've done a lot of research and you've written about like clipper ships. And I was thinking about this conversation yesterday. Whereas imagine getting on a clipper ship out of Boston or New York and all of a sudden sailing around South America and all the way into China. That's pretty daunting. Like you're alone, you're out there, you're at the whims of the sea. And I'm like, okay, well, we're designing these ships and they're going to be out in the middle of the ocean. I'm like, well, it's not as daunting as what what I call like the entrepreneurs of like the 19th century were doing in terms of like getting on these clipper ships and just sailing out to sea.
They're built out of wood too.
But we're definitely pushing the frontier in terms of like, I think there's been a lot of advancements in autonomous systems and AI, and we're benefiting from a lot of that work. So at Blue Water, we're designing and building ships for the open ocean. Our first customer is the Navy, and we will eventually build for other non-Navy customers because we really believe in maritime autonomy. And I think part of that is our generation's getting actually really comfortable with autonomous systems. And so Personally, I'm very comfortable with my car driving me to and from work. And about 90% of the time, it's just in self-driving mode. I hit a button and it just drives, and it makes it a lot less stressful. And I can enjoy a podcast or some music or do a phone call. And then I'm also comfortable getting into, self-driving vehicles. So I've been in the Waymos in Los Angeles where I have family, and, the car shows up and there's no one in the front, and the car just takes you where you want to go. And it's actually a very pleasant experience. And so I think as our generation gets comfortable with autonomous vehicles, we can see autonomy going into other spaces. The space that I'm focused on is the maritime space. And I think the most obvious use case is to build autonomous ships for the Navy. They're going to cost a little bit more money up front, but they can do a lot of missions at a much lower price point. And so that's what we've been focused on at Blue Water Autonomy. It's a hard problem because when you design ships that have to operate in the open ocean, you're not designing them so they can be autonomous for days at a time or even weeks at a time. We're talking months. And the ocean is a very harsh environment. There's a lot of things that can happen, whether it's, as you mentioned, rogue waves, lightning, like you name it. And even as we're doing this podcast, we're having a couple technical issues. And this is just two people trying to talk on a video in different states in the United States. So now imagine trying to operate a ship out at sea for months at a time and not being able to restart your computer or anything like that. That's kind of where we are today. The other thing is, I think this top of everyone's mind is AI. So my experience in mobile robotics is we trained robots how to operate sort of in warehouses. And for every movement that the robot would make, there'd be a line of code behind it. And that's pretty, fairly simple when you're in a warehouse. And if the robot's moving between stickers or if it's using a LiDAR and other sensors, it's not the hardest thing to do. It's not easy, but especially today. But what's different about companies that start today working on autonomy is we can use these foundational models in AI to basically train the robots or the ships in terms of what to do. And so the more data you have, the better these systems get, and they can learn over time. And so instead of trying to write a line of code for every single rule of the road, which is what ships have to follow, you can basically upload the document into a model, and then the model can basically read it and understand what it's supposed to do. And so I think you're going to see that these systems get a lot smarter over time. And when you think about the maritime environment, when you're driving a ship, especially, long distances, it's not like you're driving it from 9 to 5 or you're driving it for an hour in the morning, an hour at night. Like these ships are operating 24/7 a day. And so, having stood sort of the midnight watch many times, I actually think these ships can be a lot safer than kind of what we do today, which is require people to be on a bridge 24 hours throughout the day.
I was going to say, aren't people going to miss sort of the romance of the midnight watch or the dog watch?
well, we're not.
I'm being.
Yeah, I know. Here we go. We started the podcast talking about how much I enjoyed being at sea and being on the bridge, and now we're talking about sort of removing that job. No, I think there's still roles for people on ships and such. I think within the Navy for certain missions, you actually want to take all the people off just from a risk profile and make them kind of as low cost as possible. But as you think about the maritime environment, especially some large container ships, like we're not going to just pull all people off it all of a sudden, but I think we can make the jobs a lot safer and a lot more enjoyable. You don't need people standing 3 watches a day. But yeah, there's going to be a transition. So
yeah, and who's going to scrape and paint on these ships? I guess it's part of the job too. But getting back to sort of the broader global context, the geopolitical climate right now is quite unstable. We have the rise of more powerful autocratic governments, and you have China posing a major threat to Taiwan, and you also have the conflict in Ukraine. And maybe now is a good time to reread Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan's classic, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. That was from quite a while ago. And also I'd just like to do another historical tie-in. I think what you're doing is a kind of continuation of the path that Lieutenant Matthew Fontaine Maury did, where he, in the early 19th century, no one had collected all the winds and currents of the oceans of the world until he just used U.S. Navy data. And then as soon as his books were released I believe in 1850, it just gave American sailors a tremendous advantage because people sort of vaguely knew which way to go, which currents to take. But this mapped out everything, shaved off tons of time from these long voyages to China from the United States. But I think what you're doing is kind of building on that legacy of innovation. But can you speak to what's going on geopolitically right now? It's very confusing and kind of scary. And what are the best strategic uses for these autonomous vessels right now in this post 9/11 environment?
Well, you mentioned at the beginning the podcast Theodore Roosevelt, who's definitely an inspiration. in many different ways. And then you mentioned Thayer Mahan. So I actually didn't know about Thayer Mahan or the importance of sea power when I was in the Navy. I was very just focused. I was like, all right, I'm on a ship. I have a job. Let me do this job. And when I was in the Navy 20 years ago, we're all about projecting force like in the Middle East. And we weren't thinking about make sure that sea lanes all throughout the world were safe for navigation. But kind of if you go back to the early 9th century and you look at Thayer Mahan, he'd studied some of the great powers before the United States and how important sea power was. And if you look at Teddy Roosevelt, he actually sponsored and built the Great White Fleet and basically sort of these steel ships powered by steam that sailed all around the world. It was a moment for the US in terms of becoming a great maritime power, and it's very inspirational to kind of what we're doing. So I think we've kind of just taken for granted that we had the greatest Navy in the world, and we still do have the greatest Navy in the world today, but we shouldn't take that for granted. And I think as we think about the pacing threat for maritime power, it's China and it's the Pacific. And if we think about that, if we ever get in a conflict, we would have the greatest Navy in the world on day one, but what happens after day 30, day 60, day 180 in terms of our ability to repair and build new ships? And China has more than 200 times the shipbuilding capacity that the United States has. And it's not something, we weren't there in World War II when we built thousands of ships, but we just don't have that capacity. And so one of the things that excites me about what we're designing and building is we're designing and building autonomous ships that can do some of the same missions as some of our manned warships can do. But because they don't have people, they're cheaper and they're smaller and they're easier to build. And we don't need to build them at sort of the large shipyards that we have today, whether it's the Bath Iron Works or the Newport News or the GD NASCOs on the West Coast, that we can build them at all these mid-tier shipyards. And so it's kind of like rethinking what does our fleet look like? And I think, for you as a historian, it's probably easier for you to zoom out and think about the transition from going from clipper ships to then steamships and things like the Great White Fleet to then kind of the ocean liners designed by Gibbs. But we really haven't had a transition like that, I think, in the maritime industry for a while. The ships have just gotten bigger and bigger and more efficient. But now we're going to this phase where we're actually going to make a huge transition where some ships just have no people on them. And then you can redesign the entire ship and what it looks like. And that's what gets me excited today.
Now, how big are these ships that you're proposing, and where are you planning on building them? I know that, I'm sure that visiting these shipyards is extremely exciting to you. It probably brings back that sort of sense of doing something tactile. You're looking at the idea of people building, not robots, but very large objects that have to endure punishing conditions.
So there's just not one size that fits all missions for ship design and ship size. But for our kind of domain in terms of operating in what we call the blue water, the open ocean, we want to be big enough so we can survive and operate in certain sea states. We have enough fuel to basically operate across the open ocean, but we don't want to be too big because then you become more expensive and harder to build. And so when we think about the sweet spot, it's about half a football field in length. So 150 feet plus or minus. And it's basically a multi-mission ship that can carry different kind of payload modules in the back. And it's not something that we came up with per se, but it's something the Navy's been thinking about for a while. And Navy's getting really serious about. And I think there are other types of autonomous ships or boats that are more littoral based that can be smaller. We've seen some really interesting innovation happening in the Black Sea in terms of what's happening between Ukraine and Russia. But those are small speedboats that are high speed and could be autonomous for hundreds of nautical miles, but can't operate across the open ocean. And so for us, we're very kind of focused on this autonomous ship category.
And just a side question, how are you going to manage powering these ships? What's sort of going to be the power plant? And how are you going to keep refueling them?
So our approach is not to take a commercial design and put some sensors on it and then send it across the ocean. I think some people have experimented with that, and it can work in terms of certain missions that you need to be autonomous for days at a time. But a lot of ships are designed to have engineers on board kind of doing daily maintenance and when needed, repairs on a ship and standing watches. And so we've really rethought the entire ship from the keel up in terms of how you can make this thing very resilient and redundant, all the way from the navigation autonomy down to kind of like a modular architecture for the engineering and the propulsion. And something that's also, when it gets back to port, is easy to kind of maintain and repair and send back to sea. And so part of it, as we think about this, is to meet the mission criteria for the endurance and range that the Navy needs for certain missions. And then we're also trying to make it easy to build. And so you asked about where we can build these, is that we actually have mid-tier shipyards on the east, the west coast, on the Gulf Coast, and actually up in the Great Lakes regions that build ships today We have something called the Jones Act, where any ship going between, U.S. ports has to be built in the U.S. and flagged U.S. And so we have this maritime industrial base and capacity today that's good at building ferries and barges and like offshore support vessels for whether it's wind farms or oil and gas. And so these shipyards have capacity today, and these are the shipyards that we want to build these, our ship in, and they have the workforce, they have the infrastructure already in place.
Well, I think it's interesting, we're, 80 years since the end of World War II, and these things go in cycles because when the war ended, we had just a tremendous shipbuilding and manufacturing infrastructure. I mean, this country was churning out naval vessels and merchant ships at a scale that had not been known before. I think you're actually following in the footsteps of Gibbs because your ships are the successors in some ways to the Liberty ships, which should be were sort of this modular cargo vessel that be cranked out, had a very simple mechanical system. It had reciprocating engines, not turbines, because they were easy to service.
Yeah.
And you could just, any shipyard could just turn them out. I mean, I think they built a Liberty ship in 2 weeks, but things were fabricated off site. But I think, now our shipbuilding capacity in the years since has just declined, and our merchant marine is kind of in a sorry state right now. And Congress has recently passed the Ships for America Act, and it hasn't passed it. Sorry. It's currently reviewing it. Can you please describe how this bill, which does have bipartisan support, how can it revive America's long-suffering merchant marine, and how will your company play into this?
Yeah, so I was actually just in Washington, D.C. with Senator Young and Senator Kelly, who are sponsoring the Ships for America Act. And I think it's really important because I think, we're at a stage where we're focused on the tech and designing the ship, and then we want to take advantage of the maritime industrial base. But if the maritime industrial base doesn't exist, then it takes years to basically start a shipyard from scratch. And so these shipyards need to be busy both with work for the Navy and work for the commercial kind of fleet. And the Ships for America Act basically gives incentives to basically revitalize shipbuilding in the United States because, we're not as competitive in terms of the cost per steel, the cost for labor, but we need to kind of balance that out with the need to just have a industrial base if we ever got into a conflict and we needed to kind of go build or repair naval ships, and also for the merchant marine. And so I think the work and the focus in DC has really been focused on shipbuilding. I think it's an important act that hopefully we'll get through.
Well, I hope it gets through too. I think that, America, we go through these, I think maybe, in my own opinion, I think, we've been a service and tech economy, but I think maybe just for the balance of our own economy's sake, we need to get back to, building things as well. And on a personal note, you're a busy guy, you're a devoted family man with 3 kids. Do you still spend time on the water yourself? And what do you do when you're not working on robotic ships?
So I'll be on the water tomorrow, assuming the weather holds up with the family. I actually don't have many hobbies or passions outside of work and family. I'd like to say I play golf, but I've been really busy at the startup, so I haven't even played this year. Yeah, I spend time with family just outside the Boston area. I have 3 kids, 2 are in high school, and one's off to college pretty soon. And then, I do have a passion for work.
In a recent conversation you had with me, when we were talking about our paths, I was deeply moved when you said that William Francis Gibbs, the designer of the SS United States and the man who supervised the construction of more than 70% of America's naval tonnage during World War II, is one of your heroes. He's another Harvard man, had kind of a winding career. He was actually trained as a lawyer because his father said that being a naval architect is not an appropriate job. But I think he spent a lot of his life, he said so in an interview he did for the New Yorker, saying, I spent a lot of my life trying to prove my father wrong. Can you talk about what William Francis Gibbs, how he inspired you? And sadly, right now, his masterpiece, the ocean liner SS United States, is being pretty much is being partially dismantled in Mobile, Alabama. It will be sunk as a artificial reef sometime probably in November. Can you talk about how Gibbs influences what you do and your thought processes?
Yeah. So I was recently in Mobile, Alabama, and I saw the SS United States pierside, and it's just a beautiful ship. And I think, what William Francis Gibbs did extremely well is he built a performance ship. I think it still holds the record going across the Atlantic. It was a safe ship, and it could carry a lot of cargo capacity. So if we ever went to war, I think it was 25,000 troops you could carry across the Atlantic or something like that.
Now, like 15,000 entire army division.
15,000. 15,000. All right. Still like many people. But he made it beautiful at the same time, and it was inspiring. And that's where I think we need to kind of bring back shipbuilding in the United States, where we need to both build ships that are performant. And we do, like with our large man warships, like they're the best warships in the world, but also that are inspiring. And I think we've lost a little bit the art that's out there. And so as we think about building the next generations of ships for the United States, whether it's for the Navy or for commercial use, we need to be inspired. And part of it is how we design them and how they look. And I think the other part can be the technology that's inside, and they can be leading. And we have the talent base in the United States, especially on the technical side, and we can kind of infuse that into our shipbuilding. And I think, William Francis Gibbs did that over 50 years ago. And I think we can kind of bring that back to the United States, where I hope the next generation of people graduating from school can say, well, there could be a career and I could go into banking, or maybe I could be a lawyer, or I could be a consultant, or maybe I could design ships. And that could be a career that like is inspiring and that people will want to get into.
There's a really poignant photo showing the SS United States being towed past the coast of Florida. And she left Philadelphia in February on this 2-week-long tow. And oddly enough, these pictures of her at sea being pulled along by the tug Vinnick 6 went viral. And there's this picture showing the SS United States being towed off the coast of Miami, and this giant cruise ship pulls up close to her so the passengers get a look at it. And there's a picture showing the difference between the SS United States, which when she was built in 1952 was the third largest ocean liner in the world. Now she wouldn't even make the top 50. Going past this giant cruise ship that was, stacked, looked like a wedding cake, and was frankly, on one hand, a technological leap forward in terms of passenger comfort amenities, but was pretty darn ugly. And cruise ships today don't have that same awe or wow factor that they had, whether it was a battleship or an ocean liner. People would go down to the West Side in the 50s, even if they weren't traveling on these ocean liners, to just go see them come and go. There was sort of this magical experience. And now people go to Miami and say, oh, it's just another big cruise ship. No one really, that wonder factor is gone. And I think that I end the book, A Man in a Ship, with William Francis Gibbs. I flash back to when the ship is being built in Newport News, Virginia. He's with a friend, and he lies down on the bridge of the unfinished ship and looks up at the sky and hears all this noise around him. And he says, my God, don't we have fun when we're building these things?
Yeah. No, it's a great image. And I think a lot of us watch the journey of the SS United States from Philly all the way down into the Gulf, and we're just kind of reminded of her great beauty and majesty, and then the size of the ship. And so hopefully we'll bring that back to the U.S.
Well, thank you, Rylan, for your entrepreneurship, for your dedication to ships in the sea and the U.S. Navy. And I have long admired your path. And it seems like this is the culmination of a long career, and it seems like one thing has been building on top of the next, even though, as you described back in your time in the Navy, you're just sort of running on adrenaline and where do I go? But then you realize it's part of a building process, and it's something we all can learn from.
Well, Steve, thanks for being a historian and encapsulating sort of maritime history in books with amazing narratives about amazing people. And because of people like you, people like me, keep getting inspired about like this industry and kind of can reference back to the past and understand like the people before us who kind of build the foundations for us today.
Okay, well, carry on, Ryland. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Steve.
This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Thank you for listening. You can expect new episodes every week. To subscribe to the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast, visit steveujifusa.substack.com.